The wind off the Ohio River carried the ghosts of rust and damp earth. A chill, born in the Appalachian foothills, snaked through the skeletal remains of the abandoned farm, carrying the fine, gritty dust of gravel roads and the faintly sweet smell of decay. It was a place of broken things, broken fences, broken lives, broken silence. The moon was a sliver of bone, a careless scratch against black velvet, offering no comfort and little light. For the men of the sheriff's special response team, that was a blessing. They moved through the overgrown fields like wraiths, their forms dissolving into the deeper shadows cast by a collapsing barn and derelict pickup trucks. This stretch of county land had a name, one whispered between the deputies who had to patrol its haunted backroads, the Devil's Backbone. The name fit. Every tree line was a potential ambush, every darkened window a sniper's nest. Death was a patient hunter here, and it knew the terrain. At the center of the formation, Deputy Caleb Cal Rourke moved with an economy of motion that belied the weight on his shoulders. Cal was the team's tactical medic, a former Navy SEAL trained to piece back together the bodies that violence was determined to tear apart. He was of average height and lean build, his face, etched with the premature lines of focus and fatigue, a mask of calm professionalism. But beneath the tactical gear and the stoic exterior, Cal was an anchor, the quiet center of the storm that was his team. His hands, steady and sure, could place a tourniquet in the screaming chaos of a firefight as easily as they could rest on the thick coat of the warrior at his side. That warrior was Ragnar. A magnificent sable German shepherd, Ragnar padded silently beside Cal, his paws making no sound on the weed-choked ground. He wasn't just a K9 unit. He was a living, breathing extension of Cal's own senses, a four-legged miracle of instinct and training. His powerful chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, his dark, intelligent eyes scanning the oppressive gloom, his ears swiveling to catch sounds no human could perceive. Every muscle in his 80-pound frame was coiled with potential energy, ready to be unleashed by a single, silent command. Cal placed a gloved hand on the dog's broad back, a simple touch that conveyed a universe of meaning. "I'm here. Stay sharp. I've got you." Ragnar responded with a slight pressure against his leg, a silent acknowledgement. "Always. I've got you, too." Leading them was Captain Ben Carter, a man whose quiet intensity earned him the respect of every deputy under his command. Carter was tall and broad-shouldered, a natural leader who carried the responsibility for his men like a physical weight, yet never seemed to bow beneath it. He paused behind the husk of a rusted-out tractor, raising a clenched fist. The team froze, melting into the darkness as one. "Sparks, give me a comms check." Carter's voice was a low growl over the internal radio, barely disturbing the silence. "Loud and clear, Cap," came the reply. The voice belonged to Leo Chen, nicknamed Sparks, the team's communications specialist. He was younger than the others, a tech wizard who seemed more at home with circuits and satellites than a rifle, but his ability to pull a signal from thin air had saved them more than once. Carter knelt, unfolding a worn map under the faint red light of a penlight. Cal and the team's breacher, a massive, quiet man from Michigan named Deke Johnson, gathered around him. "All right, listen up," Carter said, his finger tracing a path on the map. "The informant's intel is solid. The target is the head of this distribution ring, a ghost known only as El Martillo. He's holed up in this farmhouse, 200 yards north. Thermal from the state police drone shows minimal guards, maybe 4, 5 tops. Should be a simple in and out. We go in quiet, breach the front, secure the target, and we're back for coffee before the sun's up." Cal listened, his eyes drifting from the map to the silent farm around them. He'd heard the phrase simple in and out before. It was almost always a prelude to chaos. He felt Ragnar shift beside him, a low, nearly inaudible rumble vibrating in the dog's chest. The air was still, but Ragnar sensed something wrong. Cal trusted the dog's instincts more than any drone feed. A drone couldn't smell the tension in the air or feel the vibrations of a hidden enemy. He gave Ragnar a reassuring scratch on the neck. The dog relaxed fractionally, but remained on high alert, his nose twitching, decoding the story told by the cold night air. The team moved on. They passed what was once a lively pasture, now a graveyard of collapsed fencing and shattered troughs. The wind whistled through the gaps, a mournful song for a life that was gone. Cal's mind was a practiced checklist of medical readiness: tourniquets, chest seals, morphine, decompression needles. He ran through each item in his pack mentally, praying he wouldn't need any of them. As a medic, he lived in a state of constant preparedness, hoping for the best while being intimately familiar with the worst. They reached the target farmhouse an hour before dawn. It was a 2-story clapboard structure, surrounded by a high chain-link fence topped with concertina wire. It looked exactly as the intel had described: quiet, unassuming, and lightly guarded. Too lightly. The team took up positions in the shadow of a dilapidated silo, 50 yards out. Carter scanned the target through his scope. "Looks quiet," he murmured. "Just like the pictures." Cal took a knee, one hand on Ragnar's harness. The dog was rigid, his gaze locked on the farmhouse's main gate. The hair on his neck wasn't raised, but there was a tension in his posture, a thrum of energy that Cal knew all too well. It was the stillness before the storm. Ragnar didn't see a threat. Not yet, he was sensing it. He was sensing the wrongness of the scene, the predatory quiet of a place that should have had some sign of life. "What do you think, boy?" Cal whispered, his breath fogging in the cold. Ragnar let out a soft whine, a pure sound of unease. That was enough. "Cap?" Cal's voice was low but clear over the radio. "Ragnar's not happy. Something's off." Carter turned his head slightly, his eyes meeting Cal's through the gloom. He respected Cal, and he respected the dog. In their world, instinct was often more valuable than intelligence reports. "Copy that, Cal," Carter replied. He studied the farmhouse for a long moment. "We're sticking to the plan, but expect company. Everyone, stay frosty. Deke, get ready to knock. Sparks, keep the line open. Cal, you and Ragnar stay on my 6." The order was given. The team moved, crossing the open ground in a staggered formation, their movements fluid and practiced. They reached the fence, pressing themselves against the cold, rough barrier. Deke, the breacher, moved to the heavy steel gate, his hands already beginning to set the breaching charge. He was a man of few words, his actions speaking a language of focused, controlled violence. He handled the C4 with the care of a sculptor, placing it perfectly to disintegrate the lock without bringing the whole gate down. Cal and Ragnar took up position just behind Carter, their backs to the fence. The silence was absolute now, a heavy blanket smothering all sound. Cal's heart beat a steady, powerful rhythm against his ribs. He took a deep, controlled breath, then another. He glanced down at Ragnar. The dog was a statue of perfect focus, his body a compressed spring waiting to be released. Their bond, forged over countless missions and endless hours of training, was the only thing in this chaotic world that felt solid, unbreakable. They were two parts of a single warrior, a seamless union of man and beast, ready to face whatever lay on the other side of that gate. Deke finished with the charge and gave a thumbs up. He backed away, taking cover. The team was set. "Ready." Carter's voice was a final, tension-slicing whisper of command. "Stand by to breach." Carter's command hung in the frigid air for a microsecond before Deke's thumb depressed the detonator. The world exploded in a gut punch of sound and pressure. The C4 charge didn't just open the steel gate, it vaporized the lock and hurled the metal door inward, where it slammed against the far wall of the yard with a deafening clang. For a moment, there was nothing but the ringing in their ears and the acrid smell of burnt almonds. "Go, go, go." Carter's voice cut through the haze. The point man, a lean young deputy named Manny Vargas, surged forward. Manny moved with the fluid grace of a predator, his rifle an organic extension of his body. He was the tip of the spear, the first one into the unknown. He crossed the threshold into the yard, his weapon sweeping left, then right. Cal was 2 steps behind him, Ragnar at his heel, a coiled black shadow ready to spring. But the spring uncoiled faster than Cal could have imagined. A violent, savage bark erupted from Ragnar's chest. A pure, primal sound of warning that had nothing to do with training and everything to do with instinct. Before Cal could process the alarm, Ragnar launched himself forward, a blur of sable fur and muscle. He didn't attack an enemy, he slammed his full 80-pound weight into the back of Manny's legs. The impact was brutal. Manny, caught completely by surprise, yelled out as his legs buckled, stumbling forward and crashing to the dirt. "Ragnar, what the hell?" His question was swallowed by the sun erupting at his feet. The second explosion was different. It wasn't the sharp, controlled blast of a breach. It was a deep, guttural whump that seemed to come from the earth itself. A pressure plate eyed, hidden under a loose flagstone right where Manny's next step would have landed. The blast tore a crater in the yard, sending up a geyser of dirt, rock fragments, and superheated gas. The shockwave hit Cal like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs and slamming him backward into the gate frame. The world dissolved into a vortex of white noise and blinding light. He was momentarily deaf, blind, and utterly disoriented. But Ragnar had been closer. Cal saw it happen in the surreal, slow-motion clarity that comes in moments of extreme trauma. Ragnar, having saved Manny from the epicenter, had caught the brutal edge of the blast full on. The dog was lifted from the ground, his powerful body thrown through the air like a discarded toy. He hit the distant concrete wall with a sickening thud and collapsed in a heap, alarmingly still. Then, As the ringing in Cal's ears began to subside, it was replaced by a new sound. The fast, coordinated crackle of a dozen automatic rifles opening up at once. The intel hadn't just been wrong. It had been a deliberate lie. This wasn't a safe house. It was a slaughterhouse. Muzzle flashes bloomed from every direction, not from 5 guards, but from 20 or more. They weren't just in the main house. They were in camouflage spider holes dug into the yard floor, on the roofs of the adjacent outbuildings, in every dark window. The team had walked into a perfectly designed, 360-degree kill box. Contact everywhere. Carter's voice roared, cutting through the chaos. Find cover now. The air became a hornet's nest of crisscrossing tracers. Bullets chewed chunks out of the wall around Cal, kicking up clouds of plaster dust that stung his eyes. The team, trained to react in microseconds, was already scattering, returning fire as they dove for the makeshift cover offered by low walls and debris. Deke, the big breacher, grunted as a round tore through his thigh, sending him sprawling. But Cal barely registered it. His medic's brain, which should have been scanning the entire team to triage casualties, was locked on a single target. His world had shrunk to the broken form of his partner, lying in a heap 20 feet away. Ragnar wasn't moving. A dark, glistening pool had already begun to spread out from beneath him on the pale flagstones of the yard. Ragnar. The name was ripped from Cal's throat, a raw, desperate cry. Forgetting his own safety, Cal launched himself from the cover of the gateway and ran into the kill zone. Bullets hissed past his head so close he could feel their heat. He didn't care. He ran low, his body screaming at him to get down, but his heart was pulling him forward. He slid the last few feet on his knees, coming to a stop beside the dog. The sight made his blood run cold. Ragnar's thick coat was matted with blood and filth. His haunch was a shredded mess, riddled with dozens of small, vicious-looking shrapnel wounds. His breathing was shallow, his eyes half-lidded and dull with shock. A steady, rhythmic pulse of bright red blood pumped from a deep gash in his abdomen. "Easy, boy. Easy. I got you," Cal whispered, his hands moving with practiced urgency, assessing the damage. His fingers found the source of the worst bleeding. A jagged piece of metal had torn deep into Ragnar's flank. All around them, the firefight escalated into a symphony of destruction. Controlled, short bursts from the SRT's M4S were answered by the undisciplined, automatic roar of AK-47s. A grenade launcher coughed, the round screaming overhead to impact the building behind them, showering the yard in concrete and fire. Cal was oblivious. His world was the size of his dying dog. He pressed a combat gauze into the wound, using his full body weight to try and stem the bleeding. Ragnar whimpered, a low, pathetic sound that tore at Cal's soul. "I know it hurts, buddy," Cal murmured, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't allow himself to feel. "Stay with me. Stay with me." He looked up, his eyes quickly scanning the chaos. He saw Deke dragging himself behind a low wall, trying to apply a tourniquet to his own leg. He saw Carter pinned down behind an overturned feeding trough, yelling orders and returning fire. He saw Manny, his face pale from the shock of his near miss, laying down a furious stream of suppressive fire. They were trapped. They were outnumbered. And his partner, his friend, the animal who had just saved a teammate's life without a moment's hesitation, was bleeding out in his arms. The gate hadn't led to a high-value target. It had led straight into hell, and the devil was collecting his due. The universe shrank to the space between Cal Rourke's hands. The chaos of the firefight, the whip-crack of incoming rounds, the angry reply of his teammates' rifles, the percussive thump of grenades, all of it faded to a distant, irrelevant hum. His world was the warm, sticky feel of Ragnar's blood, the shallow, stuttering movement of the dog's chest, and the desperate race against a clock that was ticking in his own frantic pulse. "Okay, buddy. Okay," Cal murmured, his voice a low, steady anchor in the storm. "Let's see what we've got." His fingers, nimble and sure despite the adrenaline, probed the shredded meat of Ragnar's flank. The shrapnel wounds were numerous, a constellation of vicious tears, but they were oozing, not spraying. It was the deeper wound, in the abdomen near his back leg, that was the killer. Femoral artery. His training screamed the diagnosis at him. Without massive, immediate pressure, Ragnar had minutes, maybe less. He tore a pouch on his vest open, pulling out the largest compression bandage he carried. He pressed it into the wound with all his strength. Ragnar cried out, a strangled yelp of agony, his body convulsing. I know, Cal soothed, his face close to the dog's ear. "Stay with me. Don't you quit. You hear me? Don't you dare quit." A stream of tracers ripped the air just over his head, forcing him to flatten himself over Ragnar's body, using his own armored plates as a shield. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw two more teammates moving to support Carter. One was Frank Gallo, a seasoned deputy whose calm demeanor and salt and pepper beard made him look older than his 35 years. Frank was the team's rock, ever steady. The other was Sparks, the young comms specialist, now firing his rifle with a grim determination that belied his technical role. Then he heard a new sound, a sharp, wet cry of pain that wasn't from the enemy. "Captain's hit." Frank's voice was urgent, cutting through the din. Cal's head snapped up. His medic's instinct, temporarily eclipsed by his bond with Ragnar, roared back to life. He saw it instantly. Carter was down, slumped halfway against the overturned trough, his face a mask of agony. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle, and a dark stain was rapidly spreading across his trousers just below the knee. Triage. The cold, hard logic of his training demanded it. The commander was the priority. A human casualty over an animal casualty. He had to move. He knew he had to move. But his hands didn't leave Ragnar. They were locked in place. A human clamp fighting a losing battle against the dog's lifeblood. "Rourke." Carter's voice was a strained roar, laced with pain and command. "Get over here." "That's an order." Cal's mind was its own battlefield. He could see the tactical problem with brutal clarity. His commander was down. Deke was wounded. And the team was leaderless, pinned down in a kill box. He was the medic. His duty was clear. He glanced at Carter. Frank was already there, trying to get a tourniquet around the captain's leg, but the angle was bad and the incoming fire was too intense. "Rourke, what are you doing?" Carter yelled again, his voice cracking. He saw Cal hunched over the dog, and a look of pained understanding warred with fury on his face. "Son, you have to leave him. We're getting torn apart. Leave the dog and do your damn job." The words hit Cal harder than any bullet. Leave the dog. It was a logical, necessary command. It was the correct military decision, and it was the one thing he knew, in every fiber of his being, he could not do. He looked down into Ragnar's eyes. They were unfocused, clouded with pain, but they were fixed on him. In them, he saw the reflection of every cold night they'd stood watched together, every successful track, every silent promise passed between them. He saw the dog who had just thrown himself in front of an explosion to save a teammate. He had made this animal a promise, not in words, but in 1,000 shared moments of trust and loyalty. A promise that he would never, ever leave him behind. "No, Captain." Cal's voice was raw, defiant, shouted over the gunfire. His hands never left Ragnar. No one left behind. A look of disbelief, then anger, then a flash of something else, respect, maybe, crossed Carter's pain-filled eyes. He opened his mouth to argue, but a fresh wave of agony seized him, and he slumped back, his face ashen. The moment of decision had passed. Cal had made his choice. Now he had to live with it. The team was faltering. Without Carter's voice to direct them, their fire was becoming sporadic, disorganized. They were reacting, not acting. The enemy sensed it, and the intensity of their fire grew, pressing in closer. The calmest man under pressure. That's what they called him. Cal took a breath, shoved the guilt and the fear into a mental box, and slammed the lid. He could fall apart later. Right now, his team needed a leader, and his partner needed a medic. He would have to be both. "Manny." Cal's voice was a new sound in the yard, a clear, sharp crack of command. "Suppress that northeast roofline. They're flanking us." Manny, startled by the order, hesitated for a microsecond before his training took over. He pivoted, his rifle spitting fire at the designated target. "Sparks. Get Carter behind that solid wall. You're too exposed. Frank, cover them." The orders shot from Cal's mouth, his eyes darting around the battlefield, assessing angles, threats, and cover. Like dominoes, the team members, desperate for direction, responded. Frank laid down a thick curtain of cover fire while Sparks gritted his teeth and dragged their wounded commander a few precious feet to a better defensive position. The dynamic had shifted. It wasn't a formal transfer of power. It was a battlefield succession born of necessity. Cal was now in command. He turned his attention back to Ragnar. The compression bandage was soaked through. It wasn't enough. He needed to get the dog out of the open. Keeping pressure with one hand, he snaked the other under Ragnar's chest. "Okay, buddy. We're moving," he grunted, pulling with all his might. Ragnar was a dead weight, a dense mass of muscle and bone. Cal dragged him, inch by painful inch, across the rubble-strewn ground, out of the center of the kill box and into the relative safety of the alcove where Carter and the others were now gathered. The short distance felt like miles. He finally got Ragnar behind the wall, his lungs burning, his arms screaming from the exertion. He laid the dog down gently, his hands immediately returning to the wound. The bleeding had slowed, but it hadn't stopped. He was a medic trying to save his partner. He was a leader trying to save his team. And as the enemy closed in, he knew he was failing at both. The brief moment of control Cal had wrested from the chaos was shattered by the scream of an incoming rocket-propelled grenade. There was no time to yell a warning. The warhead slammed into the second story of the building directly above their alcove, detonating with a concussive roar that was felt more than heard. The ground bucked beneath them. A shower of concrete, rebar, and dust rained down, and the wall they were using for cover groaned in protest. A long, spider-webbed crack raced across its surface. The entire structure shuddered, a wounded beast groaning its death rattle. "This building's coming down," Frank yelled, his voice strained with alarm. "We gotta move." He was right. Their cover was about to become their tomb. Cal's eyes scanned across the yard, through the roiling dust and the deadly crossfire, to the dark maw of an outbuilding on the other side. It looked sturdier, its lower levels made of older, thicker stone. Between them and it was 50 feet of open, garbage-strewn alleyway, a shooting gallery. But it was their only chance. New position, building across the alley. Cal's command cut through the noise. "We move on my count. Manny, Frank, suppress the east and north walls. Sparks, you've got Carter. Move when you see your opening." The men gave grim nods of acknowledgement. No one questioned the order. To stay was death. Cal turned his full attention back to Ragnar. The dog's breathing was dangerously shallow. The compression bandage was a soaked red rag, and the bleeding, though slower, was constant. Moving him would be agonizing and could easily restart the arterial bleed. He had only one option. He tore a tactical tourniquet from his pack. "I'm sorry for this, buddy," he whispered, his voice catching. He expertly threaded the strap high up on Ragnar's back leg, above the wound. He cinched it down, then twisted the windlass, cranking the pressure. Ragnar's body went rigid. A long, mournful cry of pure agony escaped his throat, a sound that cut into Cal's heart like shrapnel. Cal gritted his teeth, his own eyes watering from the dust, or something else. I know. This is to keep you with me. Hang on." He locked the windlass in place, cutting off the blood flow. It was a temporary, brutal solution, a ticking clock until tissue began to die, but it was the only way to survive the move. Now came the impossible part. He knelt, setting his body. He worked one arm under Ragnar's powerful chest and the other under his hindquarters. "Okay, up we go," he grunted, bracing himself. He tried to lift and his entire body screamed in protest. Ragnar was 80 pounds of dense muscle and bone, made heavier by his limpness. Combined with Cal's own gear, armor, ammo, medical kit, rifle, the total weight was staggering. He failed the first lift. Ragnar's body slid back to the ground. Desperation gave him a surge of adrenaline. He reset his stance, getting lower, using his legs. With a guttural roar of effort, he heaved. Ragnar's body came off the ground, and Cal struggled to his feet, swaying, his muscles on fire. He managed to get the dog situated, slinging him across his right shoulder in a fireman's carry. The weight was crushing, oppressive. It forced the air from his lungs. Ragnar's head lolled near his own, the dog's warm, shallow breaths ghosting across his neck. The smell of blood was overwhelming. "Covering!" Frank's voice roared. Both he and Manny opened up, unleashing a torrent of disciplined, hammering fire that forced the enemy shooters to duck their heads. "Sparks, go!" Cal yelled, his voice strained. Sparks, the young deputy, became a beast of burden himself. He grabbed the back of Carter's vest and began dragging the big captain across the alley. Carter, barely conscious, tried to help, pushing with his good leg. Cal watched them for 3 agonizing seconds, then saw his chance. "My turn. Moving." He burst from cover, his legs churning, driving him forward. The weight on his shoulder was a malevolent force trying to drag him down, to unbalance him. Every step was a battle. The trash-filled alley was a nightmare of treacherous footing, slick patches of dirt, twisted metal, broken glass. The rifle in his left hand felt impossibly heavy. He brought it up, firing short, unaimed bursts one-handed. It wasn't marksmanship. It was noise. A desperate attempt to add to the suppression, to keep the enemy's heads down for one more precious second. The enemy recovered quickly. The air tore itself apart around him. Bullets sparked on the ground at his feet, whizzed past his ear, and hammered into the wall beside him. He felt a sharp tug at his pack, then another at his pant leg, rounds tearing through fabric but, thankfully, missing flesh. He kept moving, his world reduced to a tunnel. His vision narrowed to the doorway of the opposite building. His hearing was the roar of gunfire and the panicked, ragged sound of his own breathing. His legs were lead, his lungs burned as if filled with fire. The 80 pounds on his shoulder felt like 1,000. He could feel Ragnar's body bouncing with each jarring step. He prayed the tourniquet would hold. He was almost there, 10 feet. 5. He could see sparks dragging Carter through the door. With a final, desperate surge, Cal lunged forward, stumbling the last few steps and crashing through the entrance. He didn't fall gracefully. He collapsed, slamming into the inside wall, his legs finally giving out. He tried to twist as he fell, absorbing the impact to protect Ragnar. They went down in an exhausted heap of limbs and gear on the dusty concrete floor. For a moment he just lay there, the dead weight of Ragnar still on him, his chest heaving, greedily sucking in mouthfuls of dusty, cordite-laced air. He could hear Frank and Manny sprinting across the alley behind him, the slap of their boots on the pavement before they too tumbled into the relative safety of the new building. They were across. They were alive. Cal pushed himself up, gently sliding Ragnar's heavy, unconscious form to the floor beside him. He looked down at his partner. The tourniquet had held. But as he looked at the dog's pale gums and listened to the barely perceptible breaths, he knew all he had done was buy them a few more minutes on a clock that was rapidly running out. The new building offered not safety, but a different flavor of hell. It was the hollow shell of a small workshop, a single large room thick with the smell of damp and old oil. The air was heavy with dust motes dancing in the narrow shafts of early dawn light filtering through bullet holes. Outside, the firefight raged on, an unabated, angry storm that seemed to have a personal vendetta against the very stones of their new sanctuary. Cal pushed Ragnar's weight off him and staggered to his knees, his body one single, screaming ache. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. There was no time for it. Positions. He yelled, his voice a raw rasp. Frank, that window. Cover the alley. Manny, far corner. Watch the road. Don't let them pin us again. Report when you're set. The two remaining fighting deputies moved without hesitation, their movements economical and grim. They knew the drill. Find cover. Find a field of fire and prepare to sell their lives dearly. With a makeshift perimeter established, Cal's medic training took complete control. He scrambled across the debris, a man on a desperate triage mission. He got to Carter first. The captain was propped against the wall, his face pale and clammy. His teeth were gritted, his leg a ruin. Frank's tourniquet was high and tight, but the wound itself was a catastrophe. Easy, Cap, Cal said, his hands already cutting away the blood-soaked fabric of Carter's pants. The sight was grim. A7. 62mm round had shattered his tibia, the bone sticking out of the skin in a ghastly open fracture. He was going into shock. Sparks, hold pressure on that artery. I need to stop this bleed and splint it. He worked fast, his hands a blur of motion as he packed the wound with quick clot gauze and applied pressure dressings with practiced efficiency. He used 2 discarded pieces of rebar and a roll of tactical tape to immobilize the leg. It was brutal, but necessary. He administered a dose of morphine, knowing it was a pitiful defense against the agony of such an injury. Next was Deke. The big breacher was conscious, his face a stoic mask. The wound in his thigh was a clean through and through. Cal dressed it quickly. You're lucky, Cal grunted. Missed the bone in the artery, but you lost a lot of blood. Don't try to stand. Deke just nodded, his jaw tight. He was out of the fight. That left one patient, his most important. Cal crawled back to Ragnar. The dog hadn't moved. He was on his side, his breaths coming in faint, shallow wisps. Cal's heart seized. He ran his hands gently over the dog's body. The tourniquet was still holding, but the leg below it was already growing cold. He needed a chest seal for a sucking chest wound he found high on the ribcage. He applied it, then checked the dog's gums. They were nearly white. Massive blood loss, internal bleeding, most likely. He was dying. There was nothing more Cal could do for him here. He wasn't a surgeon, and this wasn't an operating room. A terrifying sense of helplessness washed over him, cold and suffocating. He could splint bones and plug holes, but he couldn't conjure blood out of thin air or patch shredded organs. Status report, he called out, his voice tight, trying to keep the helplessness at bay. Set, came Frank's voice from the window. Set, Manny echoed from the corner. Ammunition, Cal ordered. There was a short pause filled only by the crack of gunfire outside. Down to my last 2 mags, Manny reported, his voice strained. Same, Frank added, his tone grim. We're running on fumes, Cal. The words landed like body blows. 4 magazines between the two of them for a sustained fight, enough for less than 5 minutes of effective fire. Functionally, they were unarmed. Cal's eyes fell on Sparks, who was huddled in the corner, frantically working on the tactical radio he'd pulled from his pack. The young specialist was their only lifeline, their only link to the outside world. "Sparks, talk to me," Cal said, a flicker of hope he didn't know he still had, creeping into his voice. "I need air support and a medevac yesterday." Sparks didn't look up. He continued manipulating the controls, his face pale in the dim light. Finally, he stopped. He raised his head slowly and the look in his eyes told Cal everything before he spoke. "It's toast, Cal," Sparks said, his voice hollow. He held up the radio. The back casing was shattered, a spider web of cracks radiating from a single, shrapnel-induced puncture. Main sat radio's dead, completely useless. "The backup?" Cal pressed, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "The backup short range?" "It's working," Sparks said, and for a fleeting second, hope flared. "But the range is maybe 2 clicks, line of sight. We're in a concrete canyon, surrounded by enemy fire. I can't get a signal out to anyone. We're in a dead zone. Deaf and dumb, cut off." The words echoed in the sudden silence of the room. They were wounded, low on ammo, and completely, utterly alone. The world didn't know they were here. No one was coming. Cal looked from the broken radio to his wounded commander, to Deke, and finally his gaze rested on Ragnar. The dog's faint breaths were the only sound in the suffocating silence. Each small puff was a countdown. He saw the entire situation laid out before him with the cold, detached clarity of a surgeon viewing a terminal diagnosis. They could stay and fight, but they'd be overrun in minutes. They could try to surrender, but they all knew the fate that awaited them at the hands of these cartel enforcers. There were no good options left. Logic had failed. The plan had failed. Their technology had failed. He knelt beside Ragnar, laying a hand on the dog's still warm flank. He looked at his partner, who had charged into hell to save a friend, and felt a new emotion rise up through the exhaustion and despair. A cold, hard, brilliant rage. They would not die here. He would not let his partner die here. He knew in that moment that the rules no longer applied, the tactics, the procedures, the calculated logic of combat. It was all useless now. The only thing that could save them was something the enemy would never expect, something insane, something desperate. He had to change the board, and he had to do it now. The rage in Cal's chest cooled, hardening into something cold, sharp, and brutally pragmatic. Despair was a luxury he couldn't afford. Logic had failed, so instinct would have to take over. His eyes scanned the hellscape of the yard, locking on the dark, shattered doorway of the farmhouse they had just fled. He saw it in his mind's eye, a ghost from another lifetime, though only minutes had passed. He saw the breach, the initial chaos, and the men who had fallen. Deke was here, wounded. Carter was here, wounded. But there was a third, Shane O'Connell. A good man, a quiet expert from Toledo who had been hit near the gate in the first volley. Cal had seen him go down, and there had been no time, no chance to get to him. He was gone, but his gear, his equipment was still there. Shane, as the designated marksman, carried extra ammunition and, more importantly, the team's secondary long-range radio. It was an insane idea. A 50-yard sprint across a perfectly zeroed-in kill zone. It wasn't a tactical move. It was a suicide run. And it was their only hope. "Frank, Manny," Cal's voice was unnervingly calm, cutting through the groans of the wounded. "On my command, I need you to put every last round you have into the windows and rooflines on the east and north sides. Everything you've got. Don't stop firing until your weapons run dry." Frank, hunkered by the window, looked back at him, his face a mask of confusion and grime. "Cal, what are you talking about? We've only got a couple mags. If we burn them, we're done." "If we stay here, we're done," Cal cut him off, his gaze like flint. "Shane's pack has the secondary radio and a full ammo loadout. I'm going to get it." The silence that followed was heavier than the gunfire outside. Manny and Frank stared at him like he'd lost his mind. "That's a death sentence," Manny said flatly, his voice barely a whisper. "You won't make it 5 feet." "Their fire is focused on this building," Cal reasoned, his mind a cold computer. "They'll be expecting a defensive fight now, not a solo charge. Your fire will keep their heads down for a few seconds. That's all I'll need." "No," Frank said, shaking his head, his loyalty warring with the insanity of the plan. "We're not letting you do that. We'll find another way." Cal crawled over to him, his face inches from Frank's. There was no anger in his eyes, just a terrifying certainty. "Look at Carter. Look at Deke. Look at Ragnar," he said, his voice low and intense. There is no other way. We're on the clock and we're out of time. This is the only move we have left. Now, are you with me? Frank stared into his eyes for a long moment, seeing the unbending will in his friend's gaze. Finally, he gave a slow, reluctant nod. God help you, Cal. Cal crawled back to Ragnar, placing a hand on the dog's head. The dog's tail gave a single, weak thump against the floor. I'm coming back for you, he whispered. It wasn't a platitude. It was a vow. He got into position by the door, rifle held tight. He shrugged off his heavy medical pack, leaving it with Sparks. He needed to be as light as possible. On my mark. He yelled. He took a deep breath, his world narrowing to the 50 feet of carnage that separated him from survival. Fire. The inside of the room erupted in sound as Frank and Manny opened up, their M4s roaring, spitting a hurricane of lead across the alley. Hot brass filled the air. Cal didn't hesitate. He shot out of the doorway, a blur of motion. He ran lower than he thought possible, his legs churning, his lungs already beginning to burn. The world outside was a chaotic nightmare of sound and light. Muzzle flashes from his teammates' rifles strobed against the walls, answered almost instantly by furious return fire from the enemy. The air ripped apart around him. He heard the supersonic crack of rounds passing impossibly close. The angry buzz of ricochets whining off concrete. Sparks flew from a metal barrel as a burst stitched across it inches from his path. He didn't look. He just ran. His eyes were locked on the dark shape of his fallen teammate near the ruined gate. He covered the distance in a series of desperate, adrenaline-fueled bounds. His boots slipped on the slick, debris-strewn ground. He launched himself the last 10 feet, sliding on his chest and slamming into the wall next to Shane O'Connell's body. He was across. He lay there for a second, gasping, his heart hammering against his ribs. He rolled over, forcing himself to move. Sorry, brother, he whispered, his hands already working, unbuckling the straps on Shane's pack. He pulled it free along with the extra magazines from his vest. As he worked, a metallic glint from a small, adjacent storage shed caught his eye. Stacked against the far wall were a dozen squat metal cylinders, propane tanks, the kind used for grills and heaters. A new, far more dangerous idea ignited in his mind. This run couldn't just be for resupply. It had to be a counterattack. He grabbed the heavy pack and the magazines, then scrambled into the shed. The tanks were clustered together, a makeshift fuel depot. It was perfect. He pulled the last block of C4 from his pouch. His hands were slick with sweat, but they moved with a surgeon's precision. He slapped the sticky block onto the main valve of the largest tank in the center of the cluster, plunging a pressure-activated detonator into the soft explosive. He pulled the pin on a simple chemical timer, 3 minutes. The clock was ticking. He slung Shane's heavy pack over his shoulder, stuffed the magazines into his pouches, and crawled back to the door. The weight was awkward, throwing him off balance. The covering fire from Frank and Manny had stopped. They were out. The enemy's fire, no longer suppressed, was now converging on his position. Coming back. He yelled into his personal radio, knowing the short-range signal would reach. He gave the C4 one last look, then launched himself back into the alley. The run back was worse. He was heavier, more off balance, and the enemy knew exactly where he was. The alley became a solid wall of lead. He didn't try to fire back. Both hands were needed to balance the pack and hold his rifle. He just ran, weaving, praying. A round tore through the side of the pack, but he didn't slow. He could feel every second ticking down in his head, a relentless countdown to his own man-made hell. He saw the doorway, a dark rectangle of hope. He saw Frank and Manny leaning out, providing what little cover fire they could with their sidearms. With one last, lung-searing effort, he threw himself through the air, diving headfirst into the relative safety of the building as the world behind him exploded in a storm of concrete-chewing bullets. He hit the hard floor in a messy heap of limbs, gear, and exhaustion. The precious radio was safe beneath him. Cal collapsed in a heap, the weight of Shane's pack driving the air from his lungs. For one precious second, he allowed himself to lie on the cool concrete, his body a symphony of pain. Then the mental clock from the C4 timer screamed at him. Ammo. He gasped, shrugging off the heavy pack. Get the mags. 2 minutes, maybe less. Frank and Manny scrambled to obey, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. They tore open the pouches, distributing the fresh magazines with the desperate reverence of starving men being handed bread. The small, heavy rectangles were more precious than gold. Cal crawled to Sparks, shoving the bulky satellite radio into his hands. Make it work. I need a line to the sky right now. Sparks, his hands shaking slightly, immediately went to work. His fingers flew across the keypad, searching for a signal, a whisper from the outside world. Outside, the enemy, emboldened by the team's ceasefire, began to advance again. The intensity of incoming rounds increased, chewing at the walls of their crumbling sanctuary. Cal grabbed a fresh magazine, slapped it into his rifle, and crawled to the window next to Frank. "They think we're done," he grunted, chambering around. "Let's prove them wrong." They opened fire, the renewed, steady rhythm of their M4s a clear message to the fighters in the alley. "We're still here. We're still fighting." And then the world went white. The C4 detonated. It wasn't just an explosion. It was a miniature apocalypse. The high explosive block acted as a detonator for the dozen propane tanks, which erupted in a single, massive fuel-air explosion. A brilliant, blinding fireball roared outward from the storage shed, consuming the entire facade of the original farmhouse and a huge portion of the yard. The shockwave hit their building like the fist of God, blowing the windows inward and knocking everyone, Cal included, off their feet. The sound was a physical entity, a solid wall of noise that vibrated through their bones and teeth. The heat washed over them, a furnace blast of scorching air. For several seconds, the relentless crackle of AK-47s was replaced by the terrifying, hungry roar of the inferno. Cal pushed himself up, his ears ringing violently. He looked out the window. The yard was a sea of fire. The bodies of the enemy fighters nearest the blast had been vaporized. Others were burning. The coordinated assault had been broken, shattered by a single act of desperate, improvised sabotage. They had bought themselves a moment. "I've got a signal." Sparks' voice was a triumphant yell, cutting through the ringing in Cal's ears. "Call sign Guardian. They're on station." Cal scrambled over to him. Sparks handed him the receiver. "This is Alpha 1 Actual," he said, his voice raspy. "Who am I talking to?" The voice that came back was unnervingly calm, a detached American accent floating down from the heavens. "Alpha 1, this is Guardian. We're a state police surveillance drone. Been watching your position for the last 10 minutes. We read you 5 by 5. Your last move seems to have quieted things down a bit. What's your situation?" The pilot's calmness was an anchor in the chaos. "Guardian, we have multiple wounded, one critical. We're out of ammo, surrounded, and need immediate extraction and close air support." "Copy, Alpha," the pilot said. "Good news is your little light show scattered the rats. Bad news is..." "Hang on." There was a pause. Cal's stomach tightened. "Okay, I'm looking at you in thermal. I see a large enemy force, 20 plus, massing in the building adjacent to your position, on your west wall. They're prepping for a final assault. Looks like they're going to breach the wall and come right through." Cal's blood ran cold. The west wall, the thick stone wall his back was against. They were feet away, separated only by a few layers of rock and mortar. "Guardian, confirm," Cal said, his voice dangerously low. "They are in the building connected to mine." "That's a confirm, Alpha. They are literally your next-door neighbors, and they are not friendly." This was it. The unwinnable endgame. There was no way to defend against a breach from that range. They'd be cut down before they could raise their rifles. Cal looked at his team, at Carter, pale and nearly unconscious, at Deke, gritting his teeth in silent agony. He looked at Ragnar, his partner, his life ebbing away with each shallow breath. He had not come this far, fought this hard, to die here, cowering behind a wall. He made the decision. It wasn't a choice born of tactics or training. It was a primal, brutal calculation made at the edge of extinction. "Guardian," Cal said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Are you armed?" "That's a negative, Alpha. We're eyes only. But I can talk to the people who are. What do you need?" "I need you to tell the county sheriff's helicopter sniper team to put a .50 caliber round through the engine block of the big generator on the north side of that building." There was another pause from the sky. This one was longer. "Alpha, say again last. You want a sniper shot on a generator next to your own building?" "That's a confirm, Guardian," Cal said. "That generator powers their whole operation. It's also sitting right next to their primary fuel depot. A .50 calories incendiary round should do the trick." Manny, Frank, and Sparks, who had been listening to the exchange, went dead still, their eyes wide with horror. "Cal. No." Frank whispered, his voice trembling. "That's too close. Hell, it's not even close. That's us." "A .50 cal round in a fuel depot," Manny stammered. "It'll bring this whole building down on top of us. It's suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Cal countered, his gaze unmoving. "They're coming through that wall. This is our only chance." One wall is better than 20 hostiles. He pressed the receiver back to his mouth. Guardian, I am the acting field commander. I am authorizing a danger close fire mission. Coordinates to follow. He took the small handheld monitor from Sparks, which showed the drone's overhead view. His own building was a glowing white square. The one next to it was a hornet's nest of hot signatures. He read off the coordinates, his voice steady, betraying none of the terror coiling in his gut. The drone pilot's voice came back. It was all business now. The moment for questions was over. Coordinates received and confirmed. Alpha, risk estimate is extreme, but it's your call. Sniper team is engaging. Time to impact, 10 seconds. 10 seconds. Cal roared, dropping the receiver. Get down. Away from the west wall. Cover your heads. The last 10 seconds of their lives stretched into an eternity. Frank dragged Deke deeper into the room. Sparks huddled over the radio as if to protect it. Cal threw himself on top of Ragnar, his body a human shield, his face pressed into the dog's fur. He could feel the faint, terrified tremors running through the animal's body. 5. He could hear the faint, high-pitched whine of the helicopter. 4. He squeezed his eyes shut. 3. He thought of home, a place that seemed a million miles away. 2. He braced for the end. 1. The .50 caliber incendiary round hit the generator. The world ceased to exist. An incomprehensible force lifted them up and slammed them to the floor. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was the sound of the universe being torn in half as the fuel depot erupted. The thick stone wall beside them bowed inward, groaning under the pressure, cracks racing across its surface like lightning bolts. Dust, fire, and the screams of the dying burst from the other side. Then silence. A total, ringing, absolute silence, broken only by the crackle of fire and the slow groaning of what was left of the world. Cal pushed himself up, his body screaming in protest. He was alive. The room was a disaster, but it was intact. The wall had held. He looked down. Ragnar was still breathing. The silence. An absolute, deafening silence that was more terrifying than the gunfire had been. The world, after being torn apart, was slowly stitching itself back together, one ringing nerve ending at a time. The dust was thick and choking, blanketing the room in a ghostly haze that smelled of burnt fuel and pulverized rock. Cal pushed himself off the floor, his body a unified protest of pain. He was alive. The thought was a distant, alien concept. He coughed, the dust clawing at his throat, and looked around. Through the haze, he saw shapes moving. Frank was pushing himself up. Manny was shaking his head as if to clear water from his ears. Sparks was still huddled over the radio. They were all alive. His eyes immediately found Ragnar. The dog was lying where he'd left him, covered in a fine white powder, looking like a statue. Cal scrambled over, his heart in his throat. He laid a hand on Ragnar's chest. A faint, shallow rise and fall. Still breathing. The wall had held. The insane gamble had worked. Cal grabbed the receiver from the floor. Guardian, this is Alpha 1. You still there? The pilot's calm voice was a miracle in the silence. Still here, Alpha 1. That was impressive. The hostile force in that building is no longer a factor. I'm seeing survivors fleeing the area. The fight appears to be over, relief so powerful it nearly made him dizzy washed over Cal. But it was fleeting. Guardian, we're still critical. I need a medevac now. My men are bleeding out. Copy that, the pilot replied. Stand by. Cal turned to his team. It's over, he announced, his voice a raw croak. They're running. Help is on the way. A collective, ragged sigh of relief went through the room. The tension that had held them together like coiled springs finally released, and the full weight of their exhaustion and their injuries became apparent. Carter was groaning, his face a deathly pallor. Deke was trying to sit up, his movement stiff with pain. The drone pilot's voice came on again, but this time it was laced with concern. Alpha 1, we have a problem. The birds are inbound, but you have no viable LZ. Your firebomb in the yard has turned the approach into an inferno, and the rest of the area is too cluttered with debris. There's nowhere for them to set down. Cal's heart, which had just started to beat normally, seized in his chest. To get this close, to survive all this, only to be trapped by the very fire that had saved them. Negative, Guardian, Cal said, his mind racing, scanning the room, the ceiling, anything. There has to be a way. Stand by, Alpha. I might have something. There was a pause. Cal could picture the pilot zooming the drone's camera in, scanning every inch of their location. Your building appears to have a flat roof. It's small, and I can't tell how stable it is, but it might be your only shot. Can you get up there? Cal looked up. In the back corner of the room, obscured by shadows, was a crumbling concrete staircase leading up into darkness. It was their only way out. Confirm, Guardian. We can make the roof. All right, Alpha. I'm vectoring in a life flight crew. 2 MH6 little birds from the State Patrol Aviation Wing. They're the only ones who can make this work. Get your men ready for a rooftop evac. It's gonna be tight. A rooftop evac. Setting just one skid on the edge of the roof while the pilot held the helicopter in a perfect hover. It was one of the most dangerous and difficult maneuvers a pilot could perform. We'll be ready, Cal said. He turned to the team. All right, new plan. We're going to the roof. The next 15 minutes were a slow, agonizing journey through hell. The stairs were narrow, steep, and treacherous, littered with fallen chunks of concrete. Getting up them alone was hard enough. Getting the wounded up was a nightmare. Frank and Manny, running on their last reserves of strength, became human crutches. They supported Deke, his face slick with sweat from the effort of moving on his ruined leg. Getting Carter up was the hardest part. The big captain was a dead weight, moaning with every jostle. It took both Frank and Manny, with Sparks clearing the way, to haul their commander up the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. Cal went last. He had one more patient to move. He knelt beside Ragnar, carefully checking the tourniquet and the chest seal one last time. Then, he gathered the dog into his arms, cradling him like a child. He stood, the 80-pound burden settling once more onto his exhausted frame. He followed the others up the stairs, his legs trembling with the effort. He moved slowly, deliberately, protecting Ragnar from every bump and scrape. He could feel the dog's faint breaths against his chest, a fragile, fading rhythm. Almost there, buddy, he whispered into the dog's fur. Just a little further. They emerged onto the roof into a world of chaos. The first little bird was already there, a tiny, dark, insect-like shape hovering impossibly against the first gray streaks of dawn. Its single landing skid was planted firmly on the roof's edge. The pilot inside was a silhouette of intense concentration. The rotor wash was a physical force, a hurricane of wind and noise that threatened to blow them off their feet. 2 crew chiefs hooked into the chopper were waving frantically. Let's go. Wounded first. Frank and Manny, with Sparks' help, moved Carter first, carefully maneuvering him onto the chopper's small rear bench. Then they went back for Deke. The first chopper was full. It lifted off, its engine screaming, and vanished into the gray sky. The second little bird immediately took its place, performing the same incredible feat of airmanship. There was only room for the last 4. Frank and Manny climbed in. Let's go, Cal. Frank yelled over the roar of the rotors. Get in. Cal stood at the edge of the roof, Ragnar held tight in his arms. He looked at the crew chief, then at Frank. Take him first, he said. What? No, you first. Take him. Cal's voice was an unbreakable command. He moved to the edge, carefully, lovingly passing Ragnar's limp form into Frank's waiting arms. Frank gently laid the dog on the floor of the helicopter. Only then, when his partner was safe, did Cal allow Manny to grab his vest and haul him aboard. The moment he was inside, the helicopter shot upward, the rooftop falling away beneath them with dizzying speed. Cal collapsed onto the floor, his energy completely spent. He crawled to Ragnar, his hand finding the dog's neck. They flew over the charred, broken landscape of the farm. The place that had tried to kill them was now just a fractured map below. Cal didn't look at it. He looked at Ragnar. The dog's eyes fluttered open. They were hazy, but they focused on Cal's face. He was too weak to move his body. But with one last, monumental effort, Ragnar lifted his head just an inch and licked Cal's hand. A single, silent gesture. You came back for me. Cal's composure finally broke. He bowed his head, his shoulders shaking, and pressed his face into the thick, blood-matted fur of his friend, his partner, his hero. Weeks later, in a quiet ceremony, Deputy Caleb Rourke was awarded the Sheriff's Medal of Valor for his extraordinary courage, but he would always know the truth. The real reward wasn't the medal they pinned on his chest. It was the steady beat of his partner's heart, a sound he could now listen to in a quiet veterinary hospital back home. They had walked into the Devil's Backbone together, and together, they had flown out. The promise had been kept.